Bonjour Yvon, welcome.
Bonjour Xavier, welcome, and also welcome to Sandro. It's a great pleasure to have you both this morning on this kind of historical interview in a way if we try to qualify what we shall do. But it's a great pleasure.
Exactly, our pleasure also. Indeed, this is a part of the series of interviews that we are conducting with former IFSAM presidents. And you are one of those persons that was president of the Federation already a few years ago, but you've also been involved in other capacities, mainly as a treasurer of the Federation until very recently. And also you were organizer of one of the biannual congresses. So lots to tell. And we're looking forward to the interview. Sandro and I, Sandro being the president-elect and myself being the current president, will alternate in asking you the questions about your involvement with IFSAM. So maybe the first question, starting with the beginning, is how did you get to know about IFSAM and how you become involved with the Federation?
If I make a kind of joke, I was belonging to Alain Burlaud's connection. In fact, introduced me at IFSAM in 1993, just before the Dallas conference. And so he was expecting me to organize the Paris conference 1996, what I did. So it means that I was involved since the beginning, so after the first step were made by Alain and his colleagues. And I have organized for the scientific committee, I was conducting the scientific committee of Paris Conference 1994. And since then, I never left IFSAM because I have represented FNEGE during some years. Then I have briefly got the place of secretary when Greg was the treasurer, when Greg was president. Then I left this position, but I was always again representing FNEGE, and then I have got the three roles of president-elect, president, and past president, and I have become in, I would say, sad conditions because it was because of Eric Simon's death. He was treasurer, and so I have got this position of treasurer because when someone is dying, something complicated with the heirs and so on. So I manage the things so that I have become treasurer during several years until Wafa took the position because when Sibel and then Xavier arrived at IFSAM, they have done a lot of work. And at this stage, I think that my role was at the end. But I was very happy with all these positions. So the last one was an accident.
So thank you. You've covered very quickly the entire almost 30 years. So maybe just for the audience that might watch the video in the future, maybe you can say a few more words about this, the beginning of your involvement with the Federation. You mentioned Alain Burlaud, who was the fourth president of the Federation, and I suspect that you knew each other from CNAM, from the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers. Is that the case?
No, in fact, I was the only one. It is because we had long connections with Alain. At this stage, I was not at CNAM. I was at HEC Business School. So it means that it was before I was at CNAM. Okay. So it was related with personal strong connections with Alain, and Alain knew that if I would have organized and shared the scientific committee, something would have happened, and something has happened. In fact, 96 conference was the first great conference, because in 94, it was always the beginning of the biannual conference at IFSAM. And so 96 was the birth of huge, broader international conference.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that Alain contacted you right around the conference, the Congress of IFSAM in Dallas.
Yes.
Did you attend that one?
Yes. In fact, I have attended almost, I think, all conferences since 94.
Okay, so that was the first one that you attended?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe you can tell us about your memories about that Congress?
Yes, it was a preliminary conference for IFSAM, and it was connected with the Academy of Management, and it was a place where we have met the Academy of Management staff, and since this period, we were never forgotten by the Academy of Management staff, even there were high and low links during all this period. So it was a strong link because at this stage, the Academy of Management representatives wanted to internationalize. So today we are doing as if the internationalization and conference and international conference are something common, but at this stage it was not common. And moreover, the 94 conference was the first conference in which the Chinese colleague appears. So in a way, it's not so far away from today, but at this stage, there were no real international conference, and the Chinese didn't appear, the academic colleagues from China didn't appear in the academic game, and their first appearance was in 94 at Dallas.
Mm-hmm. Maybe before giving the floor to Sandro for the next question, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your interaction, if there was much at that point in time, I don't know, with Beyer, who was the president of the Academy of Management at that time and was also president of the Federation, the third president. And I think she was also seconded and helped to a large extent by Caroline Dexter, who was also secretary of the Federation. That's
true. So in fact, it was also a very nice period because I didn't know Janice before. This former colleague has a very strong personality in a way, as well as my personality. So we were ironically working together, sometimes giving some speeches and interacting together. So it was a really nice period, a nice colleague and a nice period, a very strong personality.
Do you remember also a little bit more in particular, specifically, what were the initiatives at that point in time that they undertook? Obviously, having the Dallas Congress was very important because that the Academy was helping in the organization of the IFSAM Congress. What were the views? What were the issues discussed at that time in the executive committee of the Federation and the Council?
If the Chinese have entered the academic game at this conference, in fact, we wanted to broaden the scope of colleagues, associations. It was a bit more difficult because also at this period in several countries, they didn't have a national association. So in fact, this conference was a way to gather people from all over the world and not only the Western world. And then after, the mission was to broaden the audience. if possible, with associations, but at this stage, there were not so much national associations, if I want to give some information about this.
So I imagine when you're referring to the Chinese colleagues, you are referring to Professor Jinchen Chen?
Yes.
From the China Academy of Management Science.
Yes, and Professor Zhu from Shanghai. In fact, it was a place where we discovered that there were two, I would say, important Chinese associations devoted to management education. And in fact, we have discovered our friends from Beijing and our friends from Shanghai.
Mm-hmm. Did they discover IFSAM or did you get in touch with them?
They discovered, I discovered them at IFSAM, but in fact, at this stage, at this period, I had a PhD student who was speaking good Chinese. And in fact, he has created some links so that I was able to take contact with his colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. You
yes,
also mentioned
something strange, but it belongs to this thing.
Interesting. So you also mentioned FNEGE, and maybe for the audience, it would be interesting if you tell us a bit more about what is FNEGE, and at that point in time, what was FNEGE view and why FNEGE was involved in the federation and still is, by the way.
So FNEGE is the first acronym is Fondation. So it's a foundation with several members. Some of them are coming from big French companies because at this stage the multinational had a nationality. Colleagues from several ministers and colleagues from the academic world. And in fact, FNEGE had no real idea or mission about management education and internationalization because FNEGE was doing other things. FNEGE has organized the fact that several colleagues went from France to the US in the early 70s. And at this stage, they were doing the same with French colleagues, spending several months, maybe sometimes 2 years in Japan. So it was its important mission to do this. For the other things, the relation with IFSAM, in fact, Alain as well as me had a good reputation, and that's why FNEGE accepted to be the French founding member at IFSAM.
Right. So this,
but it was not. Yes, it was not the most important goal. The most important mission for FNEGE.
Right.
They let us play, which is something important.
Right. So we were speaking about this foundation, which is a French national foundation with a public-private partnership, let's say, for the promotion of the education and more recently, I guess, research also in management, in corporate management. So, Sandro, I don't know if you want to continue with the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Yvon. Thank you, Xavier. I'm very curious about the impact that IFSAM, in particular IFSAM congresses, influenced your research and teaching, because we have seen the history, and would be very interesting for us to know if and which kind of influence IFSAM had on your research and teaching activity.
So the first conference were a splendid place to make links with colleagues. And in fact, I have worked with a colleague, which was at this stage, at this period, she was in Ireland. And in fact, it was the beginning of the business ethics research field in Europe. And business ethics in continental Europe was, if it is still existing, very different from what was in the US. And in fact, we didn't do the same because the historical background was completely different. And in fact, we have begun several comparisons in Europe about what could be business ethics, because the concept was imported, but without the content. And so my research field was profoundly influenced by what happened at this period, because we tried among several colleagues from different countries to give a content to what could be business ethics in Europe, in continental Europe. And for example, I was a professor, associate professor at HEC, and HEC with several business schools, Bocconi, for example, has created the community of European management schools, which still exist. But at this stage, it was a kind of, I would say, political action, because we were living in a cosmopolitan view of what could be Europe, which has not become. But at this stage, we were believing in the fact that new cosmopolitanism could be made in Europe, and especially the European Union. And that's why this SEMS had several working groups, and I have led the group devoted to business ethics, which was very interesting because when our American colleagues discovered that we were existing, they have built a specific association to share the position, because the position were very different. And so we have begun several comparisons between what was existing and what was emerging in Europe in front of what was existing in the US. So it was, for me, the place in which I have met colleagues to work on this, I would say, emerging question in management education in Europe.
On this topic, did you publish books or articles or reports?
Yes, so I have co-published some papers in journals at this period, but SEMS has printed collective books with colleagues coming from this institution to think about. So for business ethics, it was more a kind of reflection than case studies, because at this stage there were not case studies in continental Europe, case studies devoted to business ethics. And we were not sure that the case study pedagogy would be relevant for countries which has lived the two World Wars, especially the second one, during which things like whistleblowing would be unbearable, would be culturally and politically completely unbearable in continental Europe. And for example, if I take this example, whistleblowing was unbearable in Germany, in France, or in Italy, because during World War II, the collaboration between Nazi, fascist in these three countries have organized a whistleblowing which has ended in concentration camps.
Very interesting. It reminds me, actually, you were mentioning the beginning of the emergence of business ethics. And in 1991, I took, I think, the first course on business ethics at ESABE, taught by Josep Maria Lozano, who I imagine was involved also in these SEMS meetings. And your interest in business ethics, I guess, transpires in the fact that the theme, the overall theme for the 10th IFSAM Congress in 2010 that you organized in Paris had as title Justice and Sustainability in the Global Economy. I guess we'll talk more about this in the next section of the interview that relates to your involvement in the governance of the Federation, because traditionally in the past, it was the president-elect who organized the next biannual Congress.
Yes.
If we, I guess, before starting this next chapter of the interview, maybe between 1993, the Congress, or 94, the Congress in Dallas, and 2010, there are still quite a few years, 16 years. And you said that you've attended most of the Congresses. And actually, you also mentioned that your involvement in governance started with Greg Bamberg, who was president in 2001, 2002. So before getting to this period in which you get involved in the governance of the Federation, would you have any other highlights from the other Congresses that happened like in the late 90s? There was the 1996 conference in Paris, Management of Intangibles. There was the 1998 Congress in Madrid on globalization, and the 2000 Congress in Montreal, for instance.
Yes, and 2002 in Brisbane. In fact, IFSAM was the international conference until 2000 or 2002. So it means that it was for me a very exciting period, because IFSAM got more and more members, and IFSAM conference got more and more success. The highest success was what was organized, co-organized by André and ESEC conference in Montreal, because at this period, IFSAM has contributed for 1/3 of the attendance to this conference. So there was nearly 1,000 people at this congress. So it means it was also for ASAC something very big, very huge. And so the IFSAM track of the IFSAM entry was around 300 people. So in fact, it was for me the highest success we have got in internationalization. Why was the problem after? It was because the Academy of Management has internationalized its conference, and at the same time, other European international bodies and conferences were organized. It was the case with URAM. It was also the case with EGOS. So in fact, we have prepared this success, but we didn't have feedback or contribution back for having done this. So it's something on one way optimistic, but on the other way difficult. That's why after 2002, we have entered a more difficult period. And just before the Paris Congress in 2010, we have begun to lose members, especially ASAC, even despite the fact that the IFSAM president was coming from Canada, Sue Browning. She was coming from Canada, and she has learned during a conference that ASAC was leaving IFSAM. So it was the disturbing part of what I have lived at IFSAM after 2002, 2004.
It's indeed a very interesting study case of organization achieving one of its goals, one of statutory goals, which is the internationalization of its members, but in a way suffering from that success, right? It's kind of paradoxical. But maybe just before we get to that period, and again, remembering that the federation, being a federation, the members are not individual members, but associations, scholarly associations. One thing that struck me when I was looking at the history of topics of the conferences is that the topics of the IFSAM Congress seem to be really in anticipation of major issues that were only later became important in the field. For instance, in '96, talking about management of intangibles, when actually I would say that the knowledge-based view was just emerging through the works of Robert Grant and others. Globalization in 1998 already. Then in the 2004, management in a world of diversity and change, right? And then getting to later, as we will discuss, the issues of justice and sustainability. What would you say that explains maybe this anticipatory, visionary definition of the topics of the congresses?
It's very interesting. I think there are two main reasons. The first one is that a lot of representatives were at IFSAM board, were colleagues having wide thing and not short seeing. In fact, at IFSAM, we were not tied by academic conventions. That's why we were free enough to choose such topics. So on one hand, colleagues with wide views, and on the other hand, we were not tied by academic conventions. I think that these two reasons are able to give a kind of answer to your question.
Thank you. So I don't know, Sandro, would you, before we close this chapter, would you ask another question?
I think that we talked a lot about the history. It could be interesting now to pass to the second part of the interview, where we try to understand the involvement of Yvon in the IFSAM governance, if you agree, no? Because I think that we have investigated a lot of interesting insights about the congresses, the publications, the collaboration at international level. Now, we would be very interested in understanding how and when did you become involved in the governance of IFSAM, in the council of IFSAM?
In the council just during or because of Paris conference. So I have become FNEGE representative. In fact, at this stage, it's still the case. There are two representatives, and I have been one of them. And in fact, FNEGE had got difficulties to find someone replacing me. So in fact, I have co-lived with several colleagues as FNEGE representative. And these colleagues didn't want always to attend a board conference. That's why, in fact, because I wanted to do it, but because my co-representative were not so involved. So in fact, I have attended, I would say, most of the board meetings when I was representing FNEGE. So sometimes I had co-representative doing their work, but very often they didn't do it. That's why, in fact, FNEGE didn't replace me until I have entered the executive board, because at this with this position, in fact, they were in a way forced to have someone defending or representing France to the board. But during several years, in fact, I have been the only representative, because during the board meeting, the other didn't always come. Some of them never appear, and some of them have begun to appear, to disappear and to reappear because FNEGE has taken the rule. FNEGE is covering several academic associations devoted to accounting, marketing, and so on and so on. And in fact, each time they change their representatives, they try to have someone from a new association. And each representative of an association, or this functionalist association, was chairing between 2 years. In fact, sometimes they didn't find, and some other times the colleagues didn't go to the board meetings and the council meetings. Because it's far, because it's only for the board meeting is only traveling to have one meeting and so on and so on. So in a way, it is not because I wanted it, but I have really representing FNEGE during several years, which was not planned and which was not made for this. But in fact, it is what happened.
Now, council meetings don't have an excuse because of traveling, because we do it online.
Yes.
But just to be clear, and obviously this also has consequences for expenses, which is good in a way, but we have another challenge with the time zone differences. But just to clarify, so until very recently, the Federation has its supreme governing body called Council with the representatives of the different members. And as you said, each association is entitled to 2 representatives. And then there is what was until recently called the Executive Committee, now called Board. And it's not, maybe you could clarify, because you said you became representative of FNEGE for the conference in Paris?
Yes, because of the conference in Paris and some years after. That's why.
So which one?
I did the job, so I have got the position in a way. If you
right, but which one in Paris? The 96, you mean?
96.
Yes, 96. Okay, good. And so, but then you also mentioned that in terms of the executive committee, you had a stint as treasurer with Greg Bamber. So was that your first role in the executive committee?
Yes, it was my first role in the executive committee. The treasurer game is not so easy because of banking regulations. We know it perfectly now, and these regulations has been strengthened. So it's another story. But in fact, the treasurer and the bank account should be in a country in which it is possible to make international expenses and to get international money with not so much difficulties. So in fact, it could have been the case for the US, Canada, or for a European country. For other countries, it's something which is more difficult. That's why I have got this position. I have kept this position during 6 years, and I think so. Fully during Greg's mandate.
Okay, and so between this and the point in time where you got elected as president-elect, which I imagine would have been in 2009, 8? Okay, eight. How would you characterize what would be the highlights of the governance of that, the work of the executive committee?
We were crying each year about the missing members. If I want to be to have a short expression, so each year we discovered that members, founding members, for example, the German association has left, ASAC has left. So each year we were crying about this, and each year the challenge was raised by the living members. What is the value added by IFSAM? So we were clear about the value which has been added, but it was difficult to find what the value we could add except the biannual conference, and at the time during which the members raising this question with at the same time leaving the association. So we had several meetings about what is the value added by IFSAM. So in a world in which international conferences were organized everywhere, were organized by very strong associations, and in fact, we were weaker, we were beginning weaker and weaker as an international associations. That's why, in fact, we had difficulties to get out of this pit. What is the value added by IFSAM when national association is belonging to IFSAM?
Very clear, Yvon. And it would be interesting to know about your experience later as president-elect and then president and then past president. It would be interesting to know what you learned and what is your learning, your learning about this experience. And also, what is your advice to us, as president in the case of Xavier and as president-elect in my case?
So the first thing is the fact that IFSAM has overlived because strong links were built between the executive members. Because with the board members, it was more problematic. The board members were more following the executive, the member of the executive committee. So that's the first thing. So we were lucky enough to have very involved people. Even the colleagues were involved in different ways. So in fact, we were remaining with my Irish colleague, the Chinese colleague, Japanese colleague, and me. And at this stage, the Japanese association was still involved, and the Chinese association was strong involved. But beyond the Chinese association, the Irish association, FNEGE, and some other associations, in fact, IFSAM was shrinking. So we have overlived because there was a strong link between the members of the executive committee. In fact, we have found, mainly my Irish colleague and me, we have found a new door with URAM. In fact, I had personal contact since years with Sibel, which was president-elect and then president and then past president at URAM. And so I have called her, I have met her, and I say, so IFSAM has a long past history. It is something I think it is important. We have difficulties of overliving. I think that URAM could introduce something which could make IFSAM living again. And it's a case. It's a case. So the first point was when Sibel arrived, and very quickly Xavier has followed. And we were, but mainly my URAM colleagues, were able to turn IFSAM to induce another mission, which is a mission related with soft power of by editing view on several points, publications, and so on and so on. And in fact, IFSAM has got this new role, and this new role is a clear value added when National Association asks for what is the value which can be added by being a member of IFSAM.
Thank you so much. I guess there is the other question that Sandro asked about the advice that you could give us to us. I'm reminded now of the first, you mentioned Yoram arriving and joining the Federation, which we did in 2018, not so long ago, 3 years ago. And we, Sibel Yamak, the then president, and myself as vice president external relations, joined the first council meeting in Shanghai, where the last on-site, for now, the last on-site Congress of IFSAM took place, which was really an amazing learning experience. So maybe while you might think about the advice question, I wanted to go just one step back, because I'm cognizant of the fact that some of the past presidents, the former presidents, are no longer with us. And I think it's good to at least gather some memories from other former presidents who are still with us. And I was thinking, we already spoke about Jan Beyer, former president of the Academy of Management. We referred to Caroline Dexter, who unfortunately also passed away, was former secretary of the Federation, and I think was a president-elect, had been elected as president-elect. So she would have been a second president from the Academy of Management and a second woman president at that point in time of the Federation. I was thinking about Wolfgang Weber, who I imagine you interacted a little bit, because he was present in this period before you becoming president-elect. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Wolfgang Weber's and his tenure as IFSAM president. He was president of the German association, BHW.
And also he had a strong relation with the colleagues from the German association, which were founding members of IFSAM. So in fact, he was also one of the father, if he was not the main father appearing from the German side. And it was the same case for internationalization. So he has organized, I think it was 2004 conference in Berlin. And this conference was also the key point for internationalization for German colleagues. In fact, Germany has a strong tradition in management education, which was a bit apart from the other traditions. And it was the time during which the German colleagues, have taken the international conference into account. And this man was the key person to do this. So when he has organized or co-organized the Berlin conference, we have discovered a lot of German colleagues. And these colleagues, we have met them after at the Academy of Management, but no more at IFSAM. So he was a key person who has internationalized the German audience to international aspect of management education. So that's why Berlin conference was a key point, and he has defended everything which was able to be he was able to defend. And then after, when the German association left, because, in fact, the internationalization of the German academic colleagues, has occurred mainly during this conference. And then after,
right,
their own.
It seems indeed that the internationalization of the German academy goes through different periods in terms of being a priority, given also that the German system has its own journal ranking, which in a way competes, quote unquote, with other rankings that exist in the field, right? You mentioned to the German Association founding role of the Federation. By the way, the German Association is currently celebrating its centenary. It's the oldest scholarly association that we know of in the world, followed by the Japanese. And the father of the federation, Horst Albach, right, who unfortunately left us this past 25th of December. I don't know if you had the chance to interact with Professor Albach, and maybe you can say a few words about it.
Also, so if I give a stereotype of these prominent, these very important German colleagues, there are things. So in fact, these two persons had, on one hand, strong personality, on the other hand, a long academic with the official aspect career, and they had clear ideas about IFSAM at the beginning with Horst Albach, and internationalization with Wolfgang Weber. Wolfgang Weber appeared as president a bit later, but his personality was so strong that no German colleagues would criticize the position which was taken by Germany at IFSAM. And so we had avoided with Wolfgang Weber's question, which has been raised after by his followers at the German association, what is the value added if we belong to IFSAM. So when he was president, nobody would have asked this question. But also then after, our German colleagues have attended several international conferences, which has become more important with a stronger reputation than IFSAM conference. So it was the second aspect of history of the history of IFSAM. IFSAM International Conference was a key conference, but because other international conferences has appeared with more members attending, more colleagues attending this conference, the reputation of IFSAM conference has become lower. And so Wolfgang avoid this fact with German colleagues, especially because the conference was also organized in Berlin.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I don't know if at this point in time you would have a thought about these dynamics of the field overall in terms of the internationalization of the field because of the journals, and then the ranking systems and the fact of having more international or more widely diffused rankings, such as the Financial Times ranking, combined with different countries which try to have their own ranking or different schools. I mean, in France, there was a CNRS, the National Research Council, which was recently dropped, but FNEGE, the foundation that you refer, has its own ranking. There is the HEC Paris, in which both of us used to work, which has its own list. There is this German association ranking. So it seems that some countries try to preserve their own ranking, but at the same time, they are confronted with the increasing wider diffusion of other rankings worldwide.
So you raised, in fact, two implicit questions. The first one is what for a ranking is made for? Normally, in a way, the answer would be because they publish good science. It's the best place. The top ranking journals are the best place to publish the best research papers. But the second implicit question is there is a social game. And the social game is made so that, I would say, because most of best journals or the belonging to the top ranking are American, US journals. In fact, they have more mainly US authors. So it means that there is no place for non-American or a very short place for non-American. And so there is also a third implicit question in your question. It is the fact that if journals are not only made for publication or for ranking publications, ranking lists are made for our careers. So it means it can explain why a school, why a country could have competing lists in front of the main lists, because it was, so probably it will change now, but it was the case to get promotions. Having published in this ranked lists journals is the way to get a promotion. Probably it will change now because the use of ranking lists has been too tight, and in fact the institution, the business school, had forgotten that there was some teaching also. But during this game, these social games has shortened to ranking list, and the reputations of business school as well as the reputation of an author was related by the fact that they get publication in these ranked journals. Because these ranked journals, the top ranked journals, are mostly American, we were forced to have national and local lists, but the use of a list to build a career is something which is a bit short. And now it's a place, there are a lot of discussion about this. And what you have introduced, Xavier, at IFSAM, this kind of discussion is something very important, because otherwise business schools and business curriculum will disappear in 10 years. Because the social game of journal has nothing to do with the impact of published research. And this social game has become something very conventional, not only, but mainly conventional. And so conventional that if you are not belonging to this convention, you are not published. International conference played a huge role to introduce a strong critique of this game, because during this conference we have repeated this kind of critiques, and now after 10 years of critique, now the game seems to be reopened. That's why what you have introduced at IFSAM is something very important, because it is a forum in which we don't play our career, a place in which we don't play personal reputation, because it is an international association, and IFSAM have become again a true international association. So it means that it is not an European view or an American view of what is research, what could we publish, and so on and so on. And so what the discussion you have introduced at IFSAM, for me, is something very important.
Thank you so much, Yvon. I don't know, Sandro, would you like to follow up? We haven't spoken much about the 2010 conference that you organized in Paris.
The 2010 conference. So in fact, it was the first greatest difficulties which has occurred at IFSAM, because normally this conference would have been organized in New Zealand, but the colleagues who was at the same time president of IFSAM, not only president-elect, said, I am not able to organize it. And Stu Bruning was past president, and so I was expecting to become president-elect to organize 2012 conference. And in fact, there were a lot of, we had taken, with Eric, we had taken some contacts to get money, to get something interesting because there was a celebration at Nantes. And Nantes was an important harbor for slave trade. So it means that we would have a promising background. But in fact, Sue asked me, so you should organize 2010 conference. And in fact, we have taken the conference in hands because Eric as well as me wanting to have to make something successful and to have something to give to IFSAM. We have organized this conference immediately, so it means in less than 1 year and a half, because it was not planned like this. But anyway, I have no regret about this. It was necessary, and it has been the place to meet our Michael Borley, who has taken the burden for 2012 in better conditions that we took the burden. But anyway, someone should have to organize a 2010 conference. That's how it has happened.
It's very interesting. Throughout the interview, one gets a sense of let's say, the fragility on one hand of the federation, of this ebb and flow changes in engagement and membership, but also in a way it shows also its resilience during these last 30 years, despite all the different challenges. And as you said, to a large extent, it's thanks to the committed members who step up when a crisis happens, to organize the Congress or other activities. I don't know, if you want to say something more about the content of the 2010 conference.
With justice, you can now fully understand what we put justice in the title, because it was related with 2012 and Nantes as the hosting city. But anyway, we have kept this idea because 2010 is the beginning of, I would say, the rise movement of corporate social responsibility. And already at the beginning, now it's very clear, but already at the beginning, there were clear ambiguities in what was called corporate social responsibility. So putting justice on the table was not criticizing something which was rising, which was become more and more important, probably in terms of rhetorics, in terms of facts, it is another story. But in 2010, it was not possible to say that there would have been nothing made relating with corporate social responsibility. But already in 2010, there was an ambiguity related with corporate social responsibility. And that's why a way of giving, I would say, an intelligent ride critique in terms of academic dispute, in terms of academic life, was to put on the table the word of justice. That's why we did this. On one hand, because it would plan in 2012 and there would have been a great event in Nantes, and because we had already begun to think about this question of justice, and because this question of justice was becoming something important in relation with the rising weight given to corporate social responsibility. That's why we took this word as a central word of this conference.
I'm thinking just now that to what extent the discussion on corporate social responsibility was already anticipated a little bit when I look at the general theme of the Berlin Congress in 2006 on managerial responsiveness, enhancing managerial responsiveness to global challenges, was there already a seed, or was it more managerial, let's say,
No,
rather than societal?
I think it's the same thing than with business ethics. In fact, in Germany as well as in France, probably in Japan, the question of business and society is unacceptable. In fact, we think about things as business in society, and that's why our German colleague legitimately reacted to the beginning of corporate social responsibility and its business and society in a country in which, as well as in France, there is an history of business in society and not business and society. Maybe it could be a kind of arguments explaining the title of German conference in Berlin 2004 and the way through which we have caught the same idea, because it's the same thing than with whistleblowing. Our history, economic as well as military, as well as political, the two world wars took place in Germany and France, for example, if I reduce the geography. And it is still a big trauma. And this trauma has still something to say to business.
I was wondering if now, given what you said, it's the right time to actually bring maybe one of the last questions, which is, in these last years, at least in the last 2 years in which I have been involved in the Federation's executive body, you have been not only working as treasurer, but also very helpful in developing our membership strategy, in particular in Africa, because your very strong involvement and connections in Africa. And thanks to you, we have had you and others such as Alain Burlaud. We have now the Tunisian Accounting Association, the Senegalese Management Association, and very recently in December, the Moroccan Association joined the Federation. And we're very grateful for that. And I think that now the Federation can say that it has also, together with the Africa Academy of Management, quite a significant representativeness for the African continent and the African colleagues. I don't know if you would like to share with us your views on how management education and research is evolving in Africa.
I have a better knowledge about the former French or French-speaking countries than English-speaking countries, but I suspect that it is not so different. In fact, there was a kind of copy made by these countries of the French higher education system. I say higher education system, not management education, because management education has a place in this system. And these countries have adopted the Bologna process, as well as bachelor, master, and PhD degrees. So it means that we have a clear way to share maybe colleagues. Students, it has become more and more difficult because this continent is not a continent really in peace. But anyway, there is also in the European Union a kind of confusion between students and immigrants. So it's another story, but in a way, it's something which is still important. So these countries first when they educate their professors. They educate it in a complete mimetic way, and I would say an extremist mimetic way of hypothetico-deductive approach. And now these countries face other problems, and our colleagues are dealing more and more with their own issues. Sustainable issues are not the same in these countries than in our countries. Social issues are not the same. So it means that now, after I would say a step of the step when they introduced management education, because if in Europe we have introduced management education in the way through which it is understood today, in the early 70s, in fact, they only introduced management education in the early 90s. And still now, there are not so much colleagues in these countries. So in French-speaking country, in English-speaking country, it's another story, because a lot of, I would say, African colleagues work at the same time in the US or in Canada. So it means that it's another story. That's why I can't say the same thing for our colleagues from African-speaking countries. But we have to recognize that management education is very new. It has been organized in a mimetic way from Europe now, European Union now. It has begun with, I would say, surrealistic research made with hypothetical deductive canvas, which was crazy, but perhaps a necessary step. And now they really broaden their view, taking, for example, in account something which is a major issue in these countries, the informal sector, because 99% of the business is organized in this informal sector. So they have other issues, and they begin to create knowledge on the other issues. And in fact, for the informal sector, we have also an increasing informal sector in Europe. And in fact, we have lessons to take from the research, the publication made by these colleagues.
Mm-hmm. I think that these days we hear quite a bit about some voices calling for the decolonialization of management education and research, in particular in Africa. And as you know, the Federation already since its foundation in its statutes have this contextualized perspective, right? The need to take into account the different contexts, the different culture, language, values that might exist in different parts of the world. But at the same time, the Federation is to promote the diffusion of knowledge, the exchange of knowledge. And so there's going to be, as you mentioned, with the colleagues from Africa who live in the US and Canada, and maybe also the UK, there's going to be different fluxes, flows of knowledge and information across territories. So I guess if we would try to take an economic perspective in terms of what would be the optimal system, right, in which we promote and we facilitate exchange and knowing each other, so there might be some diffusion and some imitation, some drawing from other countries' systems, and at the same time we make sure that we preserve some of the, let's say, local, national context, right?
The first thing, I was surprised by this, but I don't know if it is the case in the English-speaking countries, is the way through which the two milestones of the European education system have been introduced: bachelor, master, PhD degree. So it has challenged a lot the reorganization of management education in these countries. And the second thing is the lifelong learning in a country in which people between 35 years old and more didn't have got a real management education. So it means that there is a second issue with the way through which we have introduced lifelong learning. That's the two main important things which appeared today in these countries. In terms of research, we should organize a system in which the research which is made there could be diffused in other parts of the world, because they have difficulties to publish in European journals. So they have created their own journals. In their own journals, there is still this mix between hypothetical, deductive, surrealistic research, because colleagues made their career with this. It's the same games than our game. But also at the same time, a publication about local issues which are more than local, sustainable issues or waste management in African metropoles like Dakar with more than 5 million inhabitants is a challenge, a research issue which has something to do to our countries. So the second aspect would be, how could we be able to diffuse this research in other countries and African countries in which there is something very important, which is the question of language. They don't speak English, they won't speak English, they won't learn English. So it means that this research, if I give a look on this continent, after the North African country, which is another story, you have the French-speaking countries, the English-speaking countries. They don't share very much between these two parts, and the French-speaking colleagues won't do this in English at this stage. In 10, 20 years, I am not able to say. But today, a colleague from Senegal will mainly speak and write in French, read English, but with no expectation in publishing in English.
Good. Yvon, thank you for this great interview. I think that, Xavier, if you agree, we can conclude. Thanking a lot Yvon for his great contribution to IFSAM. I learned a lot during this interview, and thank you for all the contribution you gave to our federation. And also thank you for this nice and interesting insights about the evolution of our federation. Thanks a lot.
Merci. You're welcome.
Indeed, a big thank you. Merci énormément, Yvon. It's been a very nice conversation, and in the last 2 years, I benefited a lot from many conversations and exchanges with you. I don't know if we got a direct answer to Sandro's question about your advice to us as president-elect and president. I heard you saying that several presidents have a strong personality in the past, and of course, Sandro and I cannot change our personalities. But I think, Yvon, you also have quite a personality, and it transpires, in particular, your transparency, your honesty in characterizing the events and the history of the Federation. And I think that it is indeed important, because one also needs to learn about the difficulties, about the challenges, and how to address those challenges so that as we say these days, organizations and persons become resilient. And there is no doubt that the Federation has lived many of these in its last 31 years and probably will face in the future. Just to say that not only you got the recognition for your service, also with the Outstanding Service Award that we gave last year, a year ago only, December 8th, to celebrate the 30 years of the Federation. But obviously, we also treasure and look forward to your many contributions in the future. So thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Enjoy.
Thank you.